He thought he was being discreet. He thought I didn't know he was planning to leave. He thought he'd surprise me with divorce papers and walk away with half of everything. What he didn't know was that I'd already moved every single dollar out of his reach. 100 million. Legal. Untouchable. He never saw it coming. But let me back up just a bit. We were the kind of couple people admired, at least from the outside. We had the money, the reputation, the power. Behind closed doors. I was just another wife he thought he could outmaneuver. For years I played my role. I smiled, supported, and stayed quiet when he needed to be the star. But the moment I overheard him telling someone he'd file as soon as the money's locked in, that was the moment he lost everything. Because what he didn't realize was, I built most of that empire. And I knew how to dismantle it quietly, efficiently, and legally. So while he planned to walk away with half, I walked away with all of it. You're welcome to Judgy Tales, where real stories meet real consequences. If you crave shocking betrayals, emotional twists, and poetic justice served cold, you're in the right place. This channel brings you raw, dramatic stories that will make you feel, think, and judge. So sit tight, because this story is just getting started. And trust me, you won't believe what happens when he finally finds out what I did. Clapperboard, subscribe for more twisted justice, and share your verdict in the comments below. When I first met Daniel, I was 29 and laser-focused on building my own consulting firm from the ground up. I had just landed my first 7-figure client contract and was running on caffeine, adrenaline, and raw ambition. My life wasn't balanced, but it was mine. I didn't grow up with money. I grew up watching my mom hustle, working 2 jobs, raising me alone after my dad disappeared before my 3rd birthday. So when I started making real money, I held on to it tightly. I read every line in every contract, kept my books clean. I never co-signed anything. I didn't just want success. I wanted control over my own damn life. Daniel was the opposite of that. Born into old money. A man who walked into rooms like he owned the floor beneath everyone's feet. He had a family name that opened doors, a perfect white smile that sold investment deals without a PowerPoint, and a reputation for winning. The first time we spoke, he told me I had serious shark energy, and that I should be leading something much bigger. I didn't fall for him right away, but I did fall for how he made me feel. Seen, sharp, dangerous in a good way. He saw potential in me that others overlooked, and I thought, maybe I can build with someone like that. We started dating. First, it was electric. He took me to private dinners on rooftops, invited me to art auctions where everyone whispered names and prices like secrets. I watched him work a room like a magician, turning casual nods into million-dollar pledges. I was fascinated, and then flattered, because this man wanted me. Not just any woman, but a woman with her own business, her own money, her own name. But slowly, subtly, that dynamic began to shift. We got married 2 years later. The prenup was thick. 50 pages, 6 lawyers, and a long list of standard clauses. I'd negotiated fiercely. I wanted my premarital assets protected, and I made sure every dollar I had before him stayed mine. He didn't push back, which should have been a red flag. Now I know why, because he thought eventually all the money would be ours anyway. I just thought we were building something equal. And for a while we did. Or so I believed. We co-founded a boutique venture firm together. He had the access and the trust funds. I had the sharp eye for undervalued startups, especially women-led ones that other firms ignored. Within 3 years, we were managing nearly $300 million in assets and had made headlines for 2 high-profile exits. Forbes featured us as the couple changing the venture game. But behind the scenes, things weren't as clean. He started making big decisions without telling me. Moving money, reassigning partners, ghosting founders I vouched for. When I pushed back, he'd say, "This isn't personal, it's just business." And if I pushed harder, he'd joke, "You're being emotional again." Classic gaslight. Subtle at first, but relentless. And then there were the comments. Not cruel, not obvious, but sharp in the way only a partner could cut. You'd never make this much if you weren't married to me. I'm the reason people trust our brand. Be careful. Your ego's starting to write checks your track record can't cash. Each time I heard something like that, I'd retreat a little deeper into my own corner of the business. I stopped inviting him into pitch calls. I built my own advisory board behind the scenes. I started moving my name away from the firm in subtle but strategic ways. Just in case. Because deep down, I had started to realize something I didn't want to admit out loud. Daniel didn't see me as an equal. He saw me as leverage. And leverage can always be replaced. But I still loved him. Or maybe I loved who he had been. Or who I had believed he was. We had a life, 4 homes, a lake house in Vermont, a townhouse in Tribeca, a villa we shared with his family in Tuscany. We had friends who thought we were perfect, who envied our ease, our wealth, our glamour. They didn't see the power plays. They didn't hear the way he dismissed me in meetings. They didn't see the way he smiled when he was talking to a room, but never at me. Still I stayed, because walking away felt like surrendering. And I don't do surrender. But the moment that changed everything was small. Almost boring. We were having dinner at home. Just the 2 of us. I had just signed a quiet deal to exit one of our biggest investments at triple valuation. He didn't even ask me about it. Instead, he spent the meal talking about some dinner he had with a few guys from Legacy Capital that I wasn't invited to. He dropped the name of one of our joint attorneys. Said something like, "I think you'll like how things play out next year." Pause. My fork halfway up. I smiled and said, "Play out how?" He smiled back, wide, smug and full of secrets. "Just trust me." That's when my stomach turned. That's when I knew. Because Daniel never said, "Just trust me." Not unless he was moving pieces without telling me. And I was right. 3 nights later, I found his email open on the kitchen iPad. He had no idea I'd see it. It was a forwarded message from one of his lawyers. The subject line said, "Divorce Strategy Timeline, Preliminary Draft." And that was the moment the version of my marriage I'd been clinging to died. The email detailed everything. His plan to file quietly by the end of the quarter. His intention to freeze our joint assets immediately after filing. His schedule of projected settlements based on her likely emotional state. And the kicker, a clause about ensuring she feels in control until the paperwork is served. He was trying to keep me calm, to lull me into complacency. He wanted me happy, distracted, unsuspecting. What he didn't expect was that I had been preparing for war years ago. See, Daniel didn't know everything. He didn't know I kept detailed records of all personal earnings separate from the firm. He didn't know I had an offshore entity in Singapore connected to a foundation under my maiden name. He didn't know I had retained my own legal team, quietly, precisely, and with NDAs he could never penetrate. So I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I didn't even cry. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat in the dark, and started planning. Because while Daniel was preparing to divorce me, I was preparing to disappear every dollar he thought was his. And the thing is, he never even saw it coming. I think the most dangerous lies aren't the ones someone tells you to your face. They're the ones they feed you slowly. Smile here. Nod there. A loving glance across the dinner table while they're already mapping out how to ruin you. The kind of lies that feel like comfort until the moment you wake up and realize your whole reality has been choreographed against you. That was Daniel. He didn't yell. He didn't cheat. At least not in the way you'd think. He didn't storm out or break things. What he did was so much colder. He planned. He strategized. And all while looking me straight in the eye and calling me love. The shift was so slow it was surgical. He stopped inviting me to key meetings at our firm, saying things like, "You hate these calls anyway," or "It's just logistical stuff, you don't need to waste your time." First, I believed him. We'd always had a good division of labor. I handled the vision and people. He handled numbers and structure. That was our thing. But then I noticed that pitch decks were going out under his name only. Interviews too. Partners we'd onboard together started referring to him as the sole founder. I'd spent 10 years building that company with him. I was there before we had a single client. I named the damn thing. But suddenly I was being erased. Politely, professionally, efficiently. I tried to talk to him. One night, after a long board meeting I wasn't even asked to attend, I said, "Do you feel like we're still equal in this?" He looked up from his phone and said, "Don't be dramatic." And that was the start of the gaslight spiral. Every concern I brought up was a reaction. Every question was an accusation. Every moment I reached for clarity, he made me feel like I was insecure, paranoid, or, his favorite, emotional. But the final crack came on a Tuesday morning. Daniel was out at a networking breakfast, and I was home reviewing financial reports. That's when I got a call from a junior associate at one of our satellite firms, someone who clearly didn't know not to call me directly. He was confirming the final stages of asset reallocation under Daniel's name. I asked for clarification. He paused and said, "Oh, Daniel didn't mention you were on the account." That's when my blood went cold. I hung up and started digging. And what I found made my heart stop. Daniel had already met with 2 private legal teams. He had retained a high-powered divorce attorney. He'd opened a new bank account under a shell LLC. He had quietly begun severing joint holdings and consolidating cash into protected structures in his name only. His name was on transfers. Mine wasn't. He wasn't just preparing to leave. He was preparing to strip me bare and walk out without a scratch. But the part that really set my skin on fire. He had listed me in a confidential financial doc as a non-contributing spouse. Me. The woman who brought in half of our top investors. Who drafted the firm's original acquisition strategy. Who once stayed up 4 nights straight untangling a legal mess that would have sunk us in year 2. Non-contributing. Well, this wasn't just an exit plan. This was war. And he was betting I wouldn't see it coming. But Daniel didn't know who he married. He thought I'd cry. He thought I'd crumble. He thought I'd just hand over the keys to my empire and fade into silence. He forgot I was the one who built the skeleton of our business. I was the one who dealt with every compliance audit, every staffing disaster, every goddamn investor who walked because of his ego. So I stopped confronting him. I stopped asking questions. I stopped giving him any indication that I knew. I went silent. Because that's the most powerful thing a woman can do when she's been underestimated. Go quiet and move fast. And I did. Within 48 hours, I had hired my own forensic accountant. Not one of those glossy Manhattan types with perfect hair and firm handshakes. No, I hired a woman who used to work for the IRS and looked like she chewed through steel for breakfast. She identified 3 vulnerable accounts Daniel didn't know I controlled. Ones that predated our marriage but had grown significantly in value. They were legally mine. And the best part, I'd structured them under my maiden name years ago. He hadn't thought to look there. He never did. Because in his mind, anything without his name didn't matter. While he smiled at me over dinner, I was already building the firewall. While he slept beside me, I was transferring millions. Quietly, cleanly, with full legal clearance. While he told his lawyer I'd be cooperative, I was sitting with mine reviewing international protections that would make my assets bulletproof. And I said nothing. He continued to play the role. Charming husband, public partner, strategic genius. But I knew. I watched him shake hands at events and give interviews about shared vision and partnership-driven models. I smiled next to him on panels. I let him have the spotlight. Because the spotlight only matters when the stage is real. And ours wasn't anymore. Our marriage had become a stage. Performance. One he used to buy time while preparing the dagger behind his back. But what Daniel didn't realize was that I already had the map. I knew the exits. I knew the pressure points. I knew where the money flowed and where it didn't. And I knew how to cut the oxygen. So I waited. Because if there's one thing I've learned in 10 years of business and betrayal, it's this. Never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. And Daniel was making the biggest one of his life. Daniel thought he was untouchable. That was always his problem. He believed that wealth meant control, and control meant permanence. But control isn't power. Timing is. And when someone underestimates you for long enough, they forget that you've been paying attention the entire time. And I had. The week he planned to file the divorce, his secret D-Day, as his attorney had written in the margins of one draft, I played the part of the loving, oblivious wife. I packed his suitcase for his investor trip to Chicago, kissed his cheek, even added his favorite tie. The one I had given him back when we closed our Series B round, and he still looked at me like I was his equal. That trip was the final key in the lock. You see, Daniel thought he was initiating the end. But he didn't realize I had already triggered my own private execution of our financial separation weeks earlier. What he didn't know. The majority of our money, $100 million in high-yield assets, venture profits, and private equity, had been carefully and legally transitioned into an offshore holding account I created under a structure he'd never think to check, a philanthropic shell foundation created in my late mother's name. He'd never cared about my mother, never even asked what her middle name was. But that name, unassuming and untouched, became my fortress. While Daniel was enjoying a 5-star suite at the Peninsula, I was in a secure private office 2 blocks from our firm, finalizing the last pieces of the asset shift with my legal and financial team. All of them bound by confidentiality. All of them women. Women who had clawed their way through the same kind of betrayal. They didn't need me to explain. They just got it. By the end of that 48-hour period, every penny he thought he could leverage in the divorce was gone. Not hidden. Not stolen. But protected by law, by paperwork, and by time. And then I did something I dreamed of since the moment I saw that divorce strategy draft. I printed one photo. It was from the launch party of our third fund. We were standing in front of the branded backdrop, champagne in hand, Daniel in his signature navy suit, me in a white blazer dress that the New York Times later featured in their style section. Our smiles were flawless. But if you zoomed in on my eyes, you could see it. The exact moment I realized he was already planning to cut me out. I printed that photo, slipped it into a gold envelope, and wrote one line on the back. The woman in this photo no longer exists. Good luck divorcing what you no longer own. Then I had it messengered to his suite in Chicago. Not an email. Not a text. A hand-delivered envelope. Old school. Personal. Unignorable. When he opened it that night, I can only imagine the cocktail of confusion and dread that hit him. But I didn't have to imagine long. 'Cause he called me. At 11:42 p.m. my phone rang. I was sipping wine in our kitchen, barefoot, calm, not even slightly shaken. I let it ring twice, then answered. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the edge under it. "What the hell is this?" he asked. Took a sip. "You got my message. What did you do?" That was the first time I'd heard panic in Daniel's voice in years. It was glorious. "I did exactly what you planned to do to me," I said. "Only I did it first. Cleaner. Smarter. And $100 million faster. You moved our money." I laughed softly. "Our money. Darling, you should have read the footnotes in our operating agreements more carefully. But then again, you always skipped the fine print, didn't you?" He exploded. "You don't have the right. You don't." Cut in. "You'll want to be careful what you say next." I recorded this call as soon as I picked up. There was a long pause. He realized I wasn't bluffing. I never did. Then his voice dropped. Quiet. Cold. Threatening. "You think you've won." Smiled. "No. I think you've just started to understand that I was never the pawn in your game, Daniel. I was the other player. You just never saw me sitting across the board." And I hung up. That moment, the click of the call ending, was the cleanest silence I've ever heard. Because in that moment he knew. It was over. He didn't call back. Not that night, not the next morning. For a man who built his entire identity around having the final word, the silence was deafening. But I knew what was happening. He was scrambling, calling lawyers, bankers, old contacts at offshore firms, trying to figure out where his leverage had gone. It was gone. Legally, properly, and with no breadcrumbs leading back to any wrongdoing. Everything I had done was by the book, only sharper. You don't need to lie when you own the truth and know how to file it first. Daniel returned from Chicago 3 days later. When he walked through the door, he looked smaller. Not physically. No, he was still in his perfectly tailored suit, still carried his leather briefcase like he was walking into a boardroom. But the arrogance was missing. His shoulders didn't carry power anymore. They carried defeat. I was sitting at the kitchen table, casually reading a portfolio report. He stood there for a long minute, as if waiting for me to say something. When I didn't, he spoke first. "We need to talk." I nodded without looking up. "You mean about how you tried to bankrupt me behind my back?" He flinched barely, but I saw it. "You blindsided me, Ava." I looked up slowly and met his eyes. "I protected myself. There's a difference. You tried to turn our marriage into a hostile takeover. I just executed the better strategy." He sat across from me. "We can't go to war. You don't want that." And that's when I realized just how desperate he was. He wasn't issuing threats anymore. He was negotiating. The man who tried to erase me was now trying to make peace. But I wasn't interested in peace. Not with a man who practiced betrayal like it was an investment model. "You already declared war," I said. "I just ended it before you fired the first legal shot." He leaned back, rubbed his temple like this was a stress migraine, not a collapse of his empire. "You always said we were partners." "We were, until you stopped being one." The silence stretched between us like a battlefield littered with years of shared memories. Now all ash. "What happens now?" he asked, and it was the most honest question I'd ever heard him say. And it was my turn to deliver the final twist. "Now," smiled. "Now I walk away with my dignity, my name, and every cent I built. And you, Daniel, you get to keep the one thing you always valued more than love, your pride. That's all you have left. Congratulations." He opened his mouth, closed it. He had nothing left to say, because there was no fight left to win. He had planned the perfect betrayal. He'd mapped every detail. But he hadn't planned for me to be smarter, faster, and 2 moves ahead. He forgot that when you build an empire with someone, they don't just know your strengths, they know your blind spots. And Daniel, he never saw me coming. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought Daniel would crawl back into his corner, lick his wounds, and fade into the quiet ruins of his failed coup. But I underestimated one thing. His ego. It wasn't just about the money. It never had been. It was about the humiliation of losing to someone he thought he had already outplayed. He couldn't accept that I'd beat him, so he retaliated, but not in court. That would have made him look small. No, Daniel chose a far more insidious route. It started with whispers in the investment world. Suddenly, partners who had once championed my name were sending vague, cautious emails. New investors who had been all in on my next fund started ghosting me. Industry events I was scheduled to keynote mysteriously rescheduled, or worse, rebooked with newer male faces. It didn't take long for the first rumor to land on my desk. A former PR advisor forwarded me a screenshot from a private Slack group for VC insiders. The message: "Word is Ava went rogue, pulled money from the firm without approval. Company barely recovered." And below it, a reply. "Typical. Scorched earth after getting dumped." The words hit like acid. Not because they were true, but because they were so easy to believe. That's what being a woman in this world gets you. All your power is fragile, provisional, always one whisper away from being rewritten into emotional instability. Daniel was trying to rewrite my legacy. He couldn't take my money, so now he was trying to take my name. That's when I knew. He wasn't just licking his wounds. He was fighting a covert PR war, one whisper at a time. So I did something he didn't expect. I invited him to a gala. It was a formal charity event, one we used to co-chair together. Our names were still listed on the host committee, an oversight the organizers hadn't corrected. He RSVP'd yes within an hour. Of course he did. Daniel couldn't resist a camera, or a crowd, or the illusion that he was still welcome. But I didn't show up alone. I brought a date. Not a romantic one, a legal one. I walked in with my new managing partner, a woman with a sterling reputation in asset recovery and litigation, and with her came something far more devastating than any outfit or headline. Receipts. At the event I made a toast. Not about Daniel. Not directly. I talked about trust. About what it means to build something with integrity. About how silence can be survival for women in power, but truth is the weapon we eventually unsheath when we've had enough. I looked Daniel right in the eye from across the room and raised my glass. And that night for the first time he walked out first. 2 days later, an article dropped in Fortune magazine. It was titled, "The Silent Divorce War of Silicon Alley's Power Couple, and How She Won Without Saying a Word." It wasn't a hit piece. It wasn't even personal. It was clinical. Precise. It laid out the timeline, the legal shifts, the way Daniel had begun extracting resources behind the scenes, and how those moves backfired spectacularly. The article quoted unnamed legal sources, all confirming that Ms. L acted within the full extent of her fiduciary and contractual rights. That one sentence alone was enough to destroy his narrative. The best part. Daniel didn't know who leaked it. He still doesn't. Because I didn't. I didn't have to. The world was watching now. You see, once you flip the narrative, you don't need to fight every battle. You let your silence suggest power. You let the absence of reaction become the loudest condemnation. And for a man like Daniel, who needed to be seen as the hero of every room, that silence was unbearable. That's when I knew I hadn't just won. I had ended him. Not publicly, not in a scandal, but in the most devastating way possible, by letting him see the empire he tried to take collapse, without me ever lifting a hand. He'd lost the money. He'd lost the reputation. He'd lost the one thing that mattered most to him, control. And I gained everything, freedom, power, and the beautiful satisfaction of knowing that I didn't need to scream, cry, or rage to win. All I needed to do was disappear with the truth, and leave him behind in the fiction he built for himself. I expected Daniel to fade away after that. Most men do, when the story they've tried to control breaks loose and reshapes itself without their permission. But Daniel was never just most men. He was too polished, too deeply addicted to being admired. He couldn't accept being irrelevant. So he did what narcissists do best. He tried to manufacture a comeback. First, it was subtle. A new Instagram account, more curated than ever. Photos of him consulting with tech founders, mentoring young entrepreneurs. Hashtagged with things like #resilience, #second act, #integrity first. All words he'd never once used in real life, but now clung to like armor. And then came the podcast tour. He landed a spot on a rising startup podcast hosted by a VC bro who clearly didn't care about due diligence. The episode was titled, "What I Learned Losing It All, A Founder's Redemption Arc." In it, Daniel spun a story that barely resembled the truth. He talked about naive mistakes and over-trusting advisors, as if his betrayal of me had been some clerical oversight. He painted me as deeply intelligent but emotionally reactive, and claimed that I'd taken drastic action out of fear, not strategy. He even had the audacity to say, "I still wish her the best. We built something incredible. I just wish we'd had better communication." I was furious, not because he was lying, that was expected, but because his lies were so carefully designed to sound like grace. The kind of lies people believe when they're packaged in soft tones and fake accountability. But I didn't respond. Not publicly. Not then. Instead, I waited. Because Daniel's biggest weakness had always been his need for an audience. And now he was gathering one again. So I let him perform. He booked more appearances. Gave keynotes at second-tier conferences. Posted reels of himself doing mentorship coffees with baby founders in Soho cafes. He was crafting a narrative of rebirth. And just when he started getting traction again, When the first glossy profile about his maturity after loss hit Fast Company, I released the final move. It was an article, not a smear piece, not revenge porn, just facts, written by a respected investigative journalist I'd once helped during a major corporate takedown. I didn't bribe him. I didn't even ask him to write it. I just sent him documents, hundreds of them, quietly, legally, all detailing Daniel's pre-divorce maneuvers, his shell corporations, his attempts to hide assets, the fake invoices, the bank trails. And then I walked away. I didn't ask when it would run. I didn't ask what it would say. I just waited. And when the article dropped, it hit the startup world like a bomb. The headline read, "The Divorce Daniel L. doesn't talk about," and what it says about founders who think they're untouchable. It was brutal. It didn't just eviscerate his financial behavior. It framed it as a symptom of something bigger, a culture of unchecked ego in the startup world. He wasn't just greedy. He was a case study. That was the twist he never saw coming. He thought I wanted revenge. He didn't realize I wanted a reckoning. Within a week, 2 of his new ventures lost key investors. A women-led VC firm pulled out publicly, citing ethical misalignment. The podcast episode was taken down with a note about editorial reevaluation, and that Fast Company profile retracted quietly but permanently. Daniel went silent again. Only this time it wasn't calculated. It was real. Because now, he didn't just look like a man who'd lost a marriage. He looked like a man who had tried to orchestrate a lie, and got caught with receipts on the record forever. And me. I didn't gloat. I didn't post a thing. I didn't even mention his name. Because I didn't need to. Everyone else was saying it for me. The industry stopped whispering. They started warning. Not about me. About him. And just like that, the empire Daniel tried to steal crumbled under the weight of his own hubris. Not because I fought louder, but because I fought smarter. Because I didn't need to win the narrative. I just needed to make sure the truth had a place to land, and time to grow teeth. And now, every time someone Googles his name, every time he tries to pitch at a table, every time he steps on a stage, the ghost of what he did is standing behind him. And me. I'm free. Not just rich. Not just safe. But seen. Not as a victim. As the architect of my own salvation. After the article dropped, Daniel went into hiding. Not literally, of course. He still had his penthouse, still sipped espresso at overpriced cafes, still attended meetings with men who valued appearances more than ethics. But his presence, his larger-than-life persona, was gone. He was no longer the man you called to close a deal. He was the cautionary tale people whispered about when the drinks kicked in. But that wasn't enough for me. Because the money had it. The reputation. I had salvaged it. The respect. Slowly rebuilding. But what I didn't have, what I still needed, was closure. Not for me. For every woman like me who'd been underestimated, sidelined, or played like a pawn in a world built to celebrate male ego. So I created something that would destroy what little image he had left, and make it unavoidable. Started with a speaking tour. I was invited to headline a private Women in Finance event in Manhattan. Small room. Selective crowd. High net worth women, fund managers, founders. People who'd lived through the same betrayal I had. But in silence. I decided to tell them the truth. All of it. But not in rage. Not in victimhood. In strategy. I walked them through how to structure protective trusts. How to build silent equity holdings. How to document and date red flags before they turn into lawsuits. How to win a war without ever firing the first shot. I used my story as the case study, but I didn't have to name him. Because every woman in that room had their own Daniel. The speech went viral. Someone recorded it, shared it on LinkedIn. Then Reddit. Then TikTok. Within a week, I was being called the divorce strategist, in forums I didn't even know existed. And guess what? I leaned in. I launched a quiet consultancy, just a shell firm at first, called Catalyst Strategies. It didn't market itself. No Instagram. No flashy branding. It didn't need to. Because every client came from referral. And every single one. A woman on the brink. Some were being pushed out of startups they co-founded. Others were facing corporate betrayal. A few were wives of wealthy men who thought a prenup was a prison sentence. I didn't just give them advice. I gave them weaponized intelligence. In 6 months, we helped over 20 women restructure their holdings before their husbands could touch them. One woman, a hedge fund partner in Miami, cried when she realized she had access to every offshore document her husband had tried to keep hidden for years. That was the beginning of the movement. And Daniel, he hated it. Because people stopped inviting him. Not because I asked them to, but because they were afraid of being next. Because now, in the world we both once ruled together, he was the symbol of what happens when you cross the wrong woman. And still, I wasn't done. Because Daniel had started a new firm. Crappy. Desperate. Backed by 2 anonymous investors and run out of a WeWork. He'd recruited a few hungry Ivy League grads who didn't know better. They thought they were joining the comeback of a legend. So I sent them a message. Not directly. I'm far more elegant than that. I had a friend at a private equity publication leak a story. Former co-founder of Titan Equity investigated for financial misconduct during marital asset transfer. Now, was he under investigation? Not formally. But investigated is a delicious word. Sticks. It lingers. The article listed no allegations, just questions, documents, patterns, and at the bottom, single sentence. Multiple sources close to the matter suggest that internal audits may have prompted recent investor withdrawals. That line. It buried him. Within 3 days, his firm's Instagram went dark. The site redirected to a 404. The employees removed him from LinkedIn. And Daniel, he tried to play it cool, post a photo with a cocktail on a beach. But the comments weren't kind. They weren't cruel either. They were worse. They were pitying. Hope you're okay, man. Rough week. Keep your head up. We've all been there. For a man like Daniel, pity is the ultimate punishment. And that's when I let go. Not because I forgave him, but because I didn't need to remember him anymore. He was no longer a villain. No longer a threat. He was a footnote in my rise. Months later I received a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A handwritten note. Delivered by courier. On heavy cream cardstock. His handwriting. Inside just one line. I never saw you coming. I read it once. Then I burned it. And smiled. Because that's the difference between Daniel and me. He plotted betrayal with arrogance. I built survival with precision. He thought I would break. I built an empire from the rubble. He planned to leave me. I made sure he had nothing to leave with. They say betrayal changes you. But I don't think that's quite true. Betrayal doesn't change you. It reveals you. It strips away your illusions, the masks you wear for comfort, and forces you to meet yourself naked in the dark. No safety net. No denial. Just you and the hard truth of who you are when someone you trusted tries to break you. And what I found standing in that darkness was not weakness. It was fire. I didn't burn with revenge. I burned with clarity. With purpose. With the quiet, steady rage of a woman who had spent too long believing that loyalty guaranteed safety. That love meant protection. Doesn't. Real love can't be blind. Has to be fierce. Clear-eyed. Built not just on warmth and chemistry, but on respect and trust and truth. And when Daniel broke that, when he chose greed over partnership, manipulation over honesty, he made one fatal mistake. He assumed I was playing the same game he was. But I never was. He played for domination. Played for liberation. And that's why I won. Not because I was smarter, though I was. Not because I was richer, though I made sure I would be. I won because I refused to let his betrayal become my identity. I didn't let heartbreak paralyze me. I let it mobilize me. And in doing so, I didn't just save myself. I became someone I had always suspected I could be, but never fully dared to become. Whole. Not the wife of, or the co-founder with, or the woman behind the scenes. Not the quiet strategist in the shadow of his spotlight. For me, fully. And that, I think, is what scared him most. Not the lawyers, not the money, not the article, but the realization that I had always been capable of this, that I had always had power, and that the only reason he'd ever felt stronger was because I'd once chosen to hold myself back for the sake of peace. No more. So what's the lesson here? What's the takeaway? Some will say, protect your assets. Others will say, always have a plan B. And sure, those are practical surface-level lessons. But the real lesson: don't mistake silence for submission. Don't confuse grace with weakness. And never ever assume that someone's love is a leash. Because when women stop explaining themselves, when we stop shrinking to fit into the narratives that men design for us, we don't just survive betrayal. We turn it into architecture. We build new structures, new empires, forged from the rubble of what they tried to bury us under. And when we rise from that, we rise without apology. We rise with intention. We rise unrecognizable to the men who thought they'd defined us. I get asked now if I would do it all over again, if I would marry Daniel, knowing what he would become. And my answer is complicated, because I don't regret what I lost. But I am profoundly grateful for what I found. I found the limits of my tolerance. I found the edge of my patience. And then I found the woman who lived beyond those limits, waiting for me. She's not softer. She's not crueler. She's just sovereign. That's the word I come back to again and again. Sovereign. I don't need permission anymore. Not from a partner. Not from an industry. Not from the stories men tell about women like me when we stop making them comfortable. And to the women watching this, maybe with tears in your eyes, maybe with anger in your chest, maybe with a knowing smirk because you've lived this too, I want you to hear me. You are allowed to leave before the final blow. You are allowed to build escape plans in silence. You are allowed to be strategic about your safety. You are allowed to walk away from people who weaponize love to keep you small. And most of all, you are allowed to win. Not just survive. Win. He planned to leave me. He thought I'd shatter. He thought I'd beg. He thought I'd drown in regret while he walked away with everything we built. But I didn't shatter. I didn't beg. And I sure as hell didn't drown. I moved my $100 million before he could even touch it. And in doing so, I moved myself into the light, into peace, into power. And now, I live my life with one unshakable truth burned into my bones. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can do is stop pretending she's powerless. Because when she stops pretending, she becomes unstoppable. If you've made it this far, thank you. Truly. Because this isn't just a story. It's a warning, mirror, fire starter. And maybe, just maybe, it's a wake-up call. Somewhere out there, someone is watching this video and realizing that they've been giving too much grace to the wrong person. That they've been shrinking themselves to keep someone else comfortable. That they've been silencing their own power. Out of fear, out of love, or out of the illusion that loyalty will protect them. If that's you, see you. And you're not alone. That's what Judgy Tales is all about. Here we don't just tell stories for shock value. We tell stories because they matter. Because they echo. Because they leave bruises and light torches in places you didn't even know were dark. We bring the uncomfortable into the light. We don't flinch from messy. We lean in. And if this story spoke to something in you, if you felt your pulse rise, your breath hitch, your mind scream yes, or finally, or even I needed this, then here's what I need you to do. Backhand index pointing right first, hit that like button. Not because it feeds the algorithm, but because it tells us this kind of storytelling matters. That real, raw stories about betrayal, revenge, redemption, and justice still have a place in a world obsessed with filters and fake apologies. Backhand index pointing right then, go ahead and subscribe. Because this isn't a one-off. Every week, we dive deep into the tangled, dramatic, heartbreaking, and sometimes wildly satisfying stories that too many people sweep under the rug. Stories that challenge. Stories that heal. Stories that demand judgment and deserve to be heard. backhand index pointing right, and don't forget to tap that notification bell so you don't miss the next twist, the next confession, the next courtroom level takedown or family implosion that will have you screaming at your screen and texting your friends. Here at Judgy Tales, we don't do quiet. We don't do polite avoidance. We do truth. We do drama. We do justice. So if you're tired of curated perfection and ready for raw stories with real stakes, this is your space, your community, your people. And hey, maybe you've got a story of your own. One that still echoes in the back of your mind at night. One that never got the ending it deserved. Well, maybe it's time to tell it. 'Cause here your truth is power. And your power, it's the one thing they never expect you to claim, until it's too late. So again, if this story meant something to you, if it shook you or freed you or lit a fire somewhere deep inside, ear listen. Balance scale judge. Beach balloon and share your thoughts below. And remember, this isn't just entertainment. This is a reminder, a warning, a revolution in the shape of a story. So stay tuned, because the next tale might just be yours. Backhand index pointing right like. Backhand index pointing right subscribe. Backhand index pointing right hit the bell. Backhand index pointing right, and never forget. They plan to leave you powerless. But here we learn how to make that their biggest mistake. This is Judgy Tales. And justice. We don't wait for it. We write it.